And Paul and I know each other from a number of different parts of our lives in terms of our journey, but I'm a farm kid from Kearney Park. So how many of you know where Kearney Park is between Kerman and Fresno? Nobody knows where Kearney Park is?
We got a couple over there.
Okay. So I grew up there, and I still farm there. Anyhow, welcome. Thank you for allowing me to be here with your class. What are we, juniors, seniors?
Juniors, yeah.
Upper division, lower division?
This is
Okay.
the intro poli-sci class.
Okay, good. Well, I told Paul earlier that we could talk about immigration. We can certainly talk about education. We can talk about healthcare. We can talk about agriculture. We can talk about water. We can talk about terrorism, both domestic and abroad. And we can talk about trade. And we can talk about the international challenges our nation's facing. I'm on the vice chair of the Transatlantic Legislators Dialogue. I have been for 10 years with members of the European Parliament and the European Commission. Spent a fair amount of time in the Middle East. I'm also on the NATO Assembly. We have a meeting coming up here at the end of the month in Nova Scotia. And so whatever is of interest, obviously we are getting very close to what I think a most important election in our nation's history for a lot of reasons. How many of you are registered to vote? Okay. You can still register up until Election Day. You can register to vote. And I don't know if your professor will provide you any extra credit for voting. No. But you should vote. It's one of the most important aspects of our country in terms of our Constitution and the freedoms that we hold. And I'm going to talk throughout the course of our conversation today, and I really don't want to talk too much. I want to have you ask me questions and make comments because I want it to be a conversation. I can tell you I've never, ever learned anything from hearing myself speak. And certainly this morning won't be the exception, but I do learn when you ask questions or make comments to me, and we have a conversation, and that's the part that I like. But as a entry poli-sci class, you may have various levels. I know you have various levels of our process, our political dialogue, and whether or not you're idealistic or whether you're very cynical or whether you're just kind of a matter of fact, or in many cases, a lot of university students are just disconnected. And I guess for the purpose of this conversation, you might want to tell me where category you think you are. Are you idealistic? Are you very cynical? Are you just, disconnected? Because that obviously kind of determines in part your interest for this class, I would think. But since this is where the Constitution really counts, let me begin by a couple of things. Turn in papers here. Okay, that's fine. Turn them in right there. Okay, very good. I was better when I turned in papers than when I took tests.
This one writes better.
Okay, all right. So as a part of the thesis for our conversation this morning, what I want to talk to you about is the politics of hope and the politics of fear. And these are politics that have been practiced throughout the millennia, certainly for over 200 years in the history of our nation, but they've been practiced all around the world, whether it's by fledgling Democrats or whether democratic societies is what I mean, or whether it's by autocrats or dictators or kings. I mean, I'm a big student of both American history and world history. But the politics of hope and the politics of fear have always been there. And they're being played out right now in front of us, and they have been for several years. So you've got to determine also whether you're disconnected, whether you're idealistic, or whether you're cynical as to whether or not what category appeals to you most, the politics of hope or the politics of fear. Because the campaign that's taking place and that will culminate in next Tuesday's election are being played out by both parties and by the leaders of both and by people running for office to see who they can motivate to vote and vote for them or the people they're running for. So all these ads are keyed, and where's the green? But see, what it really all comes down to is each and every one of you, us, our country, is embedded in the Constitution. And I'll tell you what my 3 favorite words are in the Constitution. My 3 favorite words are these. Starts off this way. Think about this. 240 years ago, some enlightened people, but this was the concept they started off with. It's not about me. It's not about you. It's about we as a people in a country that have certain inalienable rights, the rights to pursue liberty and happiness. Really a noble concept. It's another favorite words I have in terms of our foundations, which is what we're based on. You know, the whole notion that you have freedom of speech, that you have freedom of assembly, that you have freedom to own a weapon, that you have freedom of religion. All of these are just, they had never been put out in a document in any way like that before 240 years ago. And that there would be certain guarantees and there would be a balance of 3 branches of government to provide what? Checks and balances. One can argue that that's not working so well these days. So part of the argument on next Tuesday's election, for those who feel that way, is to restore some level of checks and balances. But you know, the other thing that I think is whether you put yourself on the idealistic prism, or whether you put yourself on the cynical prism, or whether you're just kind of fall down below where you're disconnected, or you're somewhere in the middle. See, I'm somewhere in the middle. I'm a pragmatist. I'm a realist. I see the prism I look through sees the world in the shades of gray that I think people are, the shades. You know, people are good, bad, and indifferent. As you're learning in your political science class, which political science philosophers are you reading? You're going from Plato to Machiavelli to Sir Thomas Hobbes to Marx. Are you doing that?
We already mentioned Aristotle, Locke.
Locke?
We did mention Hobbes.
Okay, well, it's, you know, the reason they do that, you probably say, okay, like, why do I want to read about Aristotle, or why do I want to read about Hobbes, or what the hell does Locke have to do with me? Well, one of the things that all of these philosophers, if you just kind of key, I'll give you the cliff notes on this one. So I still remember when I was in school. Is that all of these philosophers, before they designed whatever the system on how they thought, you know, you'd create a system of government, whether it be a king or a democratic form of some kind, they all felt that they had to define the nature of man. Nature of man. Isn't that interesting? Because that's what they looked through. That was the prism they looked through. Nature of man. They meant women, but in those days, you know, how it was. So, but this is humankind. And so for a person like Hobbes, who basically believed the nature of man was nasty, brutish, and short, well, if you think that's the world you live in, then hell, you want to put a kind of a system of government that constrains power, because the human nature is such that you don't trust people, and the people are nasty toward one another, and they're mean, and life is short. So that's the kind of system you create. And if you're like Machiavelli, who you have to take a more liberal view that basically people are benign and generally want to be kind and help one another, then you create a more liberal system that spreads power around. And so when it got to us in the 18th century, you had these enlightened people who had been looking at about all these people you're reading about now. So let's have this discussion. How many people would you put yourself in the category, raise your hand, of the politics of fear? What do you fear? I mean, do you fear that caravan coming across the border? Do you fear China? Do you fear Canada? You know, when we put these trade policies out, the Department of Commerce is required to determine for the president to act on that executive order that, in fact, that nation poses a security risk. This is the absurdity, in my view, about part of this executive order. And for a president who complained loudly about the previous president using his executive authority power, this guy is making the last one look like a piker in terms of his desire to use executive power. But basically, they have to declare that Canada is a security risk to invoke these tariffs. So in this mind-boggling, we have a 3,100-mile border with Canada that is largely unprotected. Canada's been our ally in every war that we've been, but to invoke these tariffs, we've had to determine that Canada poses a national security risk, which is, I think, absurd. Anyway, we can talk about that in the concept straight. So nobody raised their hand that the politics of fear is something that you subscribe to. That doesn't motivate you to vote one way or the other. Okay, how about the politics of hope? Does the politics of hope motivate you in any fashion? When people are saying, you know, we can do better, we can have a better education system, we can have investments in our transportation system that will create more jobs and a better economy. You know, we can do better as a country when we're together. Do the politics of hope appeal to you, any of you? Raise your hand. Okay, about half the class. Do you get my sense of what I'm saying in terms of whether we're talking about health care, whether we're talking about education, whether we're talking about immigration, whether we're talking about terrorism, domestic or foreign terrorism, or whether we're talking about trade policy, or agriculture or water, on how the campaigns are messaging in this climate that we're in here and have been for the last month, the last 6 weeks, either through the politics of hope or through the politics of fear. Do you see that? Do you see that in the ads? So, with that premise, let's have the conversation about anything and everything you want. So who wants to ask the first question? I only ask that you identify yourself and you tell me what your major is. You can tell me where you're from. Who wants to go first? Paul, this is a quiet class.
Yeah, the 5 o'clock one is always good.
They're nicer?
These guys will warm up.
They'll warm up to you? You know, it's November 1st. The election's 5 days away. Who's counting? I am. It's been a long campaign. I haven't had a day off.
Tuesday we talked
7-8 weeks.
We talked about the executive order and birthright citizenship.
Yeah. What do you think about it? Do you think the president can do that?
No, I think it's unconstitutional.
Yeah. What do you think? What do you want to become a lawyer?
No, I'm going to be a social worker.
Oh, good.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
I was actually going to ask you.
Sure.
My name's Paula.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
Your name's what?
Paula.
Paula?
Mm-hmm.
Where are you from?
I'm from Bakersfield.
Bakersfield?
Mm-hmm.
Used to represent Bakersfield. Which high school did you go?
North High.
North High?
Mm-hmm.
Good school.
I was going to ask you where your stand on DACA was.
I've been very clear that we need a clean DACA. It was obvious, I think, if you look back, that the president repealed the previous president's executive order on the Dreamers only because he wanted to leverage it for that wall that supposedly I thought Mexico was going to pay for. What happened to that? Mexico's not going to pay for any wall. And that's part of the debate that's taking place right now, to have a wall or not to have a wall. That's why he's talking about sending more troops to the border than we currently have in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, even though the caravan's at best 3 weeks away from getting there. It all has to do with next Tuesday's election. He's going to make an announcement this afternoon. And you know, there's Middle Eastern terrorists there, and there's people with leprosy, people who have, you know, all sorts of other diseases that they're bringing to the border. And that, what would you say, in what category does that president's statement follow? This one or this one?
Fear.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's pretty clear. Pretty clear. I don't always dot my I's. When I do, I make circles sometimes. So I support a Clean Dream Act, and I've supported comprehensive immigration reform under the Bush administration, under the Obama administration, and I'm not sure what the immigration policy is of this administration except to divide people. I think it's strongly anti-immigrant, it seems to me, based upon separation of children, putting caps, and our best hope, and I hope in the next Congress we maybe go back to that, is what Senator John McCain did in 2013, where you had a real bipartisan bill that was comprehensive, that got out of the Senate 68-32. I would have voted for that. It wasn't perfect, but it really dealt with the 14 million people that are here undocumented, including Dreamers, including issues where you have some in families that are here legally and some that in the same family that are not here legally, that are undocumented. It would have provided a stable workforce for agriculture. It would have required that someone who's here that are undocumented and therefore not here legally to declare themselves. If they had a job, they would pay a penalty for having come here illegally. That wasn't determined, but it would have probably been around $1,000. You would have been required not only to have a job, but to learn English within a certain time period. And if you did all those things and complied with the law, after 5 years you would be eligible for a green card, which would give you permanent residence. And then if you continued to dot the I's and cross the T's for another 7 years, on your 13th year, if you wanted to, you could apply for citizenship. And that was not only a path to legalization after paying a penalty for coming here illegally, but it would have also provided an opportunity to deal with all of the facets of the problems of our broken immigration system. It was not amnesty, but unfortunately, we had probably 170 Democratic votes in the House for it, and probably 60 or 70 Republican votes. It would have passed easily, in my view, by the 218 vote margin. But Speaker Boehner, because of the political problems within his own conference, was unwilling to bring it up. So now we've talked about the last couple of years doing it piecemeal, and you see what the results of our ability to try to do it piecemeal. And the Senate tried to come together last fall with a measure that involved a couple of aspects of it that included DACA, that included the issue of family reunification, and it provided increased border security. There's strong support, bipartisan, for increased border security. You know, this notion that somehow Democrats want open borders is nonsense. But it gets used in terms of the politics of fear. It would have dramatically increased border security, as we did in 2006 and 7 with President Bush. But the experts tell me a wall is not the best way, nor the most cost-effective way to improve border security. So does that make it clear about my position?
Yeah.
And I'm a co-sponsor of a Clean Dream Act, bring it to the fore. You know, we have almost 1,000 students here at Fresno State, probably about 600 at UC Merced, and the community colleges in this area, State Center and Merced College, estimate combined the West Hills that we may have somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000 in total. And I've met with dreamers, and you know, they're fearful to get pulled over for speeding and being deported. Next question. Yes.
My name is Costa. I'm from Stockton, mechanical engineering major here.
What kind of major?
Mechanical engineering.
Ah.
I was wondering if you could maybe, what are your feelings on the high-speed rail project that's going through California right now? What are some of the issues that this kind of face to actually get to where it is now?
I'm a big supporter of investment in infrastructure, water and transportation. I've led the efforts to try to fix our broken water system through adding for more supply with Temperance and raising San Luis Reservoir and sites, and Los Carrols providing greater opportunities to recharge our groundwater, using all the water tools in our water toolbox. In the same way that I support high-speed rail, I carried the legislation that actually put it on the ballot in 2000, and carried the legislation in 2002. It wasn't actually placed on the ballot, I think, till 2006 or 8. It was like 4 years later. That passed by 54%. It's been controversial, to be clear. I've spent a lot of time studying the high-speed rail systems in Europe and in Asia. I've spent time with the engineers, ridden the various equipment. The world is on its 4th generation of steel on rail high speed, and of course there's been maglev in China, although for China, after doing both maglev and steel on rail, they chose for themselves to, they're building 15,000 miles of steel on rail. And when you look at the success of Europe and Asia is that high-speed rail fits where you have population densities of a certain level, and we certainly have it here in the United States, in California, in the East Coast, in the West Coast, and in the East Coast. Places in the Midwest, you don't have those population densities, but you do if you combine places like Chicago and Detroit in those areas. But between 100-mile distance and 400-mile distance. If you're going less than 100 miles, you either take an automobile or you take local transit systems. If you're going more than 400 miles, you take an airplane. So over 4 decades now, where high-speed rail has proven most effective is within that 100 to 400-mile distance. And with 40 million people in California, soon to be 50 million people by the end of 2030, I think high-speed rail is going to happen. It's going to ultimately determine how it happens. Big projects, I don't care if they're big water projects or if they're big transportation projects like the Big Dig in Boston, which was over cost, heavily criticized, litigated. The people in Boston wouldn't trade right now not to have the Big Dig. The same could be said back in the 20s and the 30s for the construction of the Golden Gate Bridge and the Bay Bridge. You know, change is constant, and in your lives you're seeing change. And change is never easy. And I've observed over the years that people who do the best are those that understand change and are best able to adjust change. Let me give you an example. Does anybody believe, in terms of your own knowledge of history, that 2007 was a historical year? So what are most of you, 20, 22, I assume, in that age range? So 2007, that was 9 years ago, 8 years ago? No, it's 11 years ago, I'm sorry. Not doing my math too well. I wasn't a math major. 11 years ago, so 11 years, that made you 10, 11 years old. Can you remember when you were 10, 11, what happened in 2007 that was really earth-shattering, that you thought, man, this is going to make a difference in my life? Any of you? It's not that long ago. It's 11 years ago. I'll tell you what happened in 2007. A fellow by the name of Steve Jobs walked out to his shareholders, and he had a machine like this. He says, this machine is going to revolutionize the world. It has more computing power than the Apollo spacecraft that landed men on the moon. More computing power, just in this. And by the way, it also serves as a telephone and a pretty good camera in which you can send your photos. Think about that. That was 11 years ago. I mean, does everyone in this room have one of these? I suspect so. You know what else happened in 2007 that dramatically changed how we communicate with each other? And it's playing itself out in politics in some perverse ways. I think we've got to deal with net neutrality in some fashion, and we've got to put some sidewalls. But in 2007, a fellow by the name of Zuckerberg had just gotten out of Harvard and kind of, some say, screwed his partners. But that's another story. And created what? Facebook. And so in 2007, Facebook came out, and this machine came out. And think how much your world has changed. For better, in many ways. Some ways, not so good. And so we see our political conversation being used in part through what? Various social media platforms and through these machines in terms of how we communicate with each other. So I haven't finished answering your question on high-speed rail, but the first phase is going to be completed, or the first segments, I should say. The first phase is from Los Angeles to San Francisco at about $70 billion. And the first segment will be completed here in the next 3 years between Bakersfield and Merced. We'll begin testing trains on it. And the next challenge is to connect Merced to San Jose. And when that happens, we're going to have a fairly decent operating system between San Francisco and Bakersfield. The problem that we're having is that people want high-speed rail to follow a different path than all the other infrastructure that our parents and our grandparents and others always supported, which is a public-private partnership. I mean, name me one freeway in America that General Motors or Ford Company ever built. They don't build freeways. It's your tax dollar, either at the local or state level, that goes to subsidize the construction of that freeway. And then, of course, Ford and General Motors and all the automotive benefit from it. Show me an airport in America that United Airlines or American Airlines or Boeing ever built. The airports are either surplus former U.S. military sites, or they're sites that cities and counties have constructed, or they've taken over old military sites and they've upgraded them. We've had a history going back through the first construction of the canals back in the 18th century, the Erie-Lackawanna Canal and others, in which was the formation of the first Interstate Commerce Commission to have government, pursue an effort to partner to improve the economy. And we've had a host of administrations for the last 30 years that have talked about high-speed rail in America, Republican and Democratic administrations alike, but they've never been willing, Congress has never been willing to move to the table like they have in Europe and in Japan, say, we're going to make this happen. Now, we had that happen in the 19th century. The first Republican president, the great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln, in the middle of perhaps the most difficult time in our nation's history. The country's being torn apart in the Civil War, number one. Number two, he's trying to litigate that Civil War to keep the Union from separating. First issuing of paper money. People didn't like paper money. And, you know, the inflation was running rampant because they were trying to finance this war. And in 1862, Lincoln says, we're going to build a railroad across the country. When I read a good book, Stephen Ambrose's Nothing Like It in the World, talks about the 10-year effort to build the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, if Lincoln were alive today, you know, with 24/7 news cycle and these things, and, you know, Fox and MSNBC and all of the above, can't you see what his advisors might say? Hey, you know, this Transcontinental Railroad, it's probably a good idea. We ought to reunite the country from the West Coast to the East Coast. But why don't you wait for your second term? Of course, Lincoln never got a second term. So, hard things take boldness and vision. And so I hope I let you know how I feel about high-speed rail. We've had difficulty, but all big projects have difficulty. They always do. And that's why you're supposed to have leadership. So I've also learned if you make answers to questions long enough, you discourage further questioning. Next question.
Yeah.
Sir, my name's John. I'm a business student studying accounting.
Where are you from?
I actually live in your district. I live down in Tower. So I know where Grand Park is.
Yeah, good.
How would you respond to the fact that the high-speed rail was a ballot proposition? Voters agreed to $40 billion high-speed rail, and basically we've nearly doubled the price of the high-speed rail, and we're not going to go as fast as we wanted to go, and we have no plan to actually get over into LA.
Well, 2 points that I think I would disagree with you. One, it is high-speed rail, 240 miles an hour. So I
Stops, sir?
Huh?
Even with the constant stops that we're going to be experiencing?
No, we're not doing constant stops. You know why? Because you stagger the trains. If high-speed rail stopped at every stop, you would be correct. But that's not the way they run the systems in Europe or Japan. You get on in San Francisco, and you'll see, you know, most of the trains will have 2 or 3 stops. And the 8 o'clock train will stop in, you know, Fresno and Bakersfield and go to Los Angeles. And the 9 o'clock train will stop in Merced and Hanford and go to Los Angeles. And the 10 o'clock train, you know, I mean, that's how they do it in Europe. By definition, if high-speed rail stopped at every stop, you'd be correct. That's not the way you run it. So, and that's why you have multiple trains. You know, we have 16 daily trains now in the Amtrak service, and I had a guy back in the 80s, as I was trying to get the 4th daily train going, he says, Jim, instead of getting a 4th daily train, why don't you just add another car onto that train? I says, well, but that doesn't make sense logically. I mean, the issue is trying to get people to make it convenient so it works for their schedules. So the question isn't capacity, the question is use of time. So adding the other car isn't what's going to make it a more effective, efficient transportation system. On the issue of going over the Tehachapis, we are now working on that. There are a couple of different options between going over the existing Union Pacific route over Tehachapi and then joining Lancaster, because they're improving the grade from Lancaster to the station in the city of Los Angeles downtown. We're doing a lot of investigation with some of the leading tunneling experts in Japan and Europe to see whether it might be more cost effective, notwithstanding the seismic issues, of going through the Grapevine. That would be a more direct route. Obviously, the people inland would prefer it to go through Lancaster because of all the built-up growth there, and a lot of people that are, just as people are moving to Tracy and Los Banos that are commuting back and forth, people are also moving into the desert down there that are working in downtown Los Angeles. So those issues have to be worked out. Did I answer your question?
What about the money?
The money? Because it's a bond measure, it was always anticipated this would be the seed money, and that would get additional federal money. And the federal money has been at loggerheads because it's become a political issue. Friends of mine who were on the other side who supported high-speed rail decided that this would be a good political wedge issue. So now I give them, I tease them. I say, you know, you remind me of John Kerry. Do you remember that classic line of John Kerry in 2004, where he said, "I was for it before I was against it"? Some of my Republican friends were for high-speed rail before they were against it. You know, and it's politics. Because, you know, people either have the boldness and the vision and the courage of their convictions, and it's hard, but they stick with it, or, you know, the wind blows this way, the wind blows that way, you know, and you lean this way and you lean that way. And that's why a lot of people get frustrated with people in politics, because they, you know, they seem to have been in one place 2 years ago, and now they're in another place 2 years later because they think they won't get reelected if they don't get in that place. So, no, the cost issue has always been a challenge, but we had always felt that it was going to be a breakdown of federal, state, and local funds. And the initial $8 billion that the Obama administration put was to create seed money for about 6 high-speed rail projects in the country. And then it was felt we would then build on and beyond that. But then, of course, the Congress changed, and then that ability to do so. But so what Governor Brown decided this year is we would go it on our own and try to get enough of it completed and get a private partnership going so that when you had a more favorable administration, a more favorable climate in Washington, that not only would want to support this effort, the true state-of-the-art high-speed rail in America, 240-mile-an-hour trains, but also other rail corridors in the country that are being planned. Houston to Dallas, the north and south leg in Florida, the route between Washington, New York, and Boston. So anyway, it's not easy. It's hard, and it's filled with controversy. But you know, we can do it. I mean, that's the bottom line. How many of you traveled to Europe or Japan? Raise your hand. So we got about 3 of you. How would you compare in Europe or Japan their transportation system versus ours?
It's crazy. You can get anywhere so quickly, and there's like 5 or 6 different ways to get there. As fast as you want or as fast as you can.
Yeah. No, it's amazing. I mean, this isn't something we can't do. And I've never seen a bridge, a road, a highway, a train that was Republican or Democrat. I mean, you know, it is, this should be something, it helps the economy. You know, the irony is that a lot of the system, especially in Europe and in Japan, that now they enjoy, we were central to having that taken off. You know why? Because after World War II, we had devastated Europe, we had devastated Japan, and so what? We came in because we wanted them to become established, stable democracies and strong economies so that they could trade with us. So we created the Marshall Plan. And so a lot of that initial infrastructure, you know, we helped pay for it. And then we created NATO to provide a buffer of security. And we provided similar sort of aid for Japan so that they could get back on their feet after we had virtually destroyed much of their country. And then we created a defense treaty with Japan so that they wouldn't have any nuclear weapons. We would provide an umbrella and protect them, which therefore they could then put more money investing in their infrastructure. And guess what? Today, Japan and Europe has I would argue, in many ways, a much better infrastructure system, much more modern, much more cost-effective, much more user-friendly than the deteriorating transportation system we have in our country. And who's to blame? All of us who've been unwilling to open our eyes and see, gee, this is not hard. And guess what? All these investments pay back in dividends. Next question. Comment. I got my soapbox here. Yes, what's your name?
Alex.
Hi, Alex. How you doing?
I'm good. I'm a psych major up here. I was raised in Fresno, born in Mexico. But I had a couple questions about the water kind of situation. One reason I bring it up is because my parents, they've already got like 30 notices and they just like don't listen. And I know it wasn't like that beforehand, So like, where is it at right now? Like, what are the irrigation systems, or where's our water coming from, or what are you looking to change, kind of deal? Because I know there's water, there's like a lot of houses being built, there's the bullet train, and so there's gonna be like, more people coming to Fresno.
Yeah,
So
you know,
where is, like,
that
the water?
brings a broader question as you study this class in political science, and it's related to any other majors that you may be engaged in. If you come away from this class and this conversation we've had, I would like you to think about one thing, because see, I have a real interest. Paul has a real interest, and all of you. You may think, nah, you just came here because Paul asked you to come here and nothing else to do. No, that's not why I'm here. I'm here because each and every one of you represent the future of America. Now, you may not think about it in those terms, but you do. And I'm interested in making sure each and every one of you do well. And so is Paul. Paul farms. He could do other things. He likes teaching. And I understand why he likes teaching. As you can see, when I get in a classroom, I'm a frustrated teacher of some sort, because I like being in the classroom. I like trying to see how your creative minds are processing and reasoning and reacting. But I want you to do one thing for me, if nothing else, as you continue your education here at Fresno State, one of the leading institutions certainly in our country, certainly in the West, in all whole ways that you can measure. I want you to simply do well. I want you to graduate and pursue your dreams. Because you know why? If you do well in whatever career choices you make, our country does well. That's what I mean. This is really not rocket science. This is very simple. You are the future. And think about it in that way. Think about how your success ultimately will build upon the success of our valley and of our state and of our nation. So, so much of what we are doing in politics, for better or worse, is on something that is another controversial issue and plays itself out in many different ways in terms of the debate that we're having in this country. And someone's going to have to help me here because I don't have spell check. But it's sustainability. S-U-S-T-A-I-N.
You got one farmer trying to help another spell.
I come out?
Yep, you're good.
And this is the crucible. "200 years ago, we had 1.7 billion people on the planet. 2 years ago, 2016, we had 7 billion. 2050, it's estimated we're going to have 9 billion people. So as you're thinking about your career goals, think about these numbers. Because the question of sustainability is truly the challenge we face. So when you ask me the question about water, and Paul could tell you, you really should have not have asked him that question, because water is one of the things I've been working on for 30 years. Of course, some people say Costa's all wet, but, and maybe that's so, but there's a whole lot of ways I could respond to that question, not only in terms of how the city of Fresno is measuring your water, and now that they're not going to cite you for overusing water, and because the governor, after we got additional rains a year ago, rescinded the drought emergency. But we don't have enough water under our current water allocation system to provide all the needs of just our state. The way, I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can measure it, but the ways I choose to measure it, 50% of our water in California is used for the environment, roughly. 40% is used for agriculture, and 10% is used in our cities. And it gets back to this issue here. Everything evolves around sustainability. We have a new historic law in California passed a couple years ago that Paul's wrestling with and I'm wrestling with, called SIGMA, which is a groundwater management act that says that agricultural water districts in the next 10 years have to get a balance between how much you withdraw versus how much you put back. And so that's difficult because some of our water is being reallocated for environmental purposes, and we're having a fight over that. And of course, the population of California, now 40 million, is going to have 50 million, which puts more demand here on the pressure here we're facing. And we've got what I like to say, and you heard me say it earlier, our water tools and our water toolbox when we deal with sustainability issues. And they involve surface supply, either raising new dams or building new ones, recharge our underground, they involve tertiary treatment, tertiary treatment.
T-E-R-T-I.
T-E-R.
T-E-R. T-I-A-R-Y.
T-I-A-R-Y. That means taking wastewater, like sewer treated water. And we just did a big project up in Merced County using Modesto and Turlock tertiary treater for Del Porto Water District. It involves conservation through technology. That's drought resistance plants, drip irrigation, and then the two things that are I call them the elephants in the room, because on one hand, environmentalists don't want to talk about them, and on the other hand, agriculture doesn't want to talk about them. And what are those two elephants in the room? For the environmentalists, with climate change, there are going to be a limit to what species we can continue. And we ought to be practical about that. We ought to acknowledge that. But most of the environmental community is unwilling to do so, and it's for a host of different reasons in terms of their own political agendas. And the other elephant in the room that farmers don't want to talk about, but they're coming to deal with the reality of it, is that out of the sustainability issue, we're going to have less land in production. We hate that. We don't like it. We're struggling with it. But the reality is that, and I don't know that Paul has a guess on that number. I don't know what that number is. I mean, we have about 6 million acres in production in California. During the height of the drought, it got down to under 5 million. And I don't know, I mean, these are decisions you folks are going to ultimately be making in the career choices in terms of the sustainability. I know one thing, the production of food and fiber is a national security issue. But it doesn't get treated that way because the overwhelming majority of Californians, and I believe Americans, think food comes from a grocery store. Disconnect. Remember I talked about disconnect? You could put this under technology, but desalinization is another tool. I didn't think I'd be talking about a water class here, Paul. But anyway, so the city of Fresno, like our water districts, is struggling to figure out this question here. So I hope I answered your question in a way that kind of gives you the view of 20,000
Yeah,
feet.
it's really complicated, but better understanding.
Well, and it's even more complicated because you think that water you got in that bottle there is just water,
Yeah.
but it's not, because it could be either from a federal water source, it could be from a state water source, it could be from a local water source, or it could be from a private entity. It could come from reservoirs up in the Sierra Nevada, or it could come from water underground. And all that water, while it's all H2O in terms of its property, chemical property, it has different rules and it has different costs based upon who authorized it, when it was built, and how it was paid for. And that's why the issue of water is so complex. And I hope I explained it into a way that gives you some sense of it.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Okay? Next question or comment. Yes, what's your name?
My name is Amy.
Hi, Amy. I like your bulldog shirt.
Thanks.
I had my swag on. I thought about coming here, but I have a merchant's lunch, and I thought if I was wearing my sweats with my bulldog on my shirt, even though I'd be very comfortable with my tennis shoes.
Yeah, so I'm from Madera. I was just curious.
Went to Madera High?
I went to Madera South.
South.
Yeah.
We've got a medical clinic there now.
Yeah,
Isn't
the
that cool?
Camarina.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is really nice. Okay, so my question is, I understand you've been in the political game for a while.
Yes.
Do you think it would be beneficial for our House and our Senate to have term limits? I understand that each person has 2 years or 6
Right.
years, but would it be beneficial, because I feel like between the left and the right, we're kind of butting heads. Do you think it would kind of relieve some of the pressure if people could only be in for 2 terms or 3 terms or 4
Well, we had it in
terms?
California. We passed it in 1990, and it was in place for the state legislature for about 10 years.
Okay.
And it didn't prove to have some of the positive effects some of the people thought it might have. And then they changed it on an initiative that the voters passed, I think in 2000 or 2002, that said you could serve 12 years either in the Assembly or 12 years in the Senate. You had to make a choice. You wanted to run 6 2-year terms in the Assembly or 3 4-year terms in the Senate.
Yeah.
Because what happened was one of I always think when you talk about politics, there's a law, and you should think about it in this class with any debate and conversation you have with Paul. It's not a law that you'll probably find in your political science books, but it's really something that I deal with all the time, and I call it the law of unintended consequences. D-E-D. And then I'm testing my ability to spell today. That's close without spell check. And that means, like this law that they passed in 1990, they thought it was going to do all these good things, and then it seemed to have more adverse effects than it had good effects. I think we do have term limits. Let me make this statement to you. They're called elections. And it turns, I have a 2-year contract. I'm trying to get my contract renewed on Tuesday. Okay? That's up to the people. At the end of the day, I put my trust and faith in the people. Yes, incumbents have certain advantages, to be sure. One of them is whether or not you want to debate your opponent. The conventional wisdom is you never give your opponent, if you're an incumbent, space time, air time, exposure, because you got the advantages, you're the incumbent. But I think that, you know, if you're going to be a member of Congress or the state legislature, you need to go shoulder to shoulder and let people examine you. So I debated my opponent twice on the NBC affiliate, and the week before on Fox affiliate and PBS, and it was live streamed on KMJ, and I had 3 other forums with her, 2 on the Madera Farm Bureau and Merced Farm Bureau, and before that with the Black Political Women's organization in August, and there were 2 others that she decided not to participate in. You know, so term limits, I think also, in my view, run contrary to what is, I think, a important American aspect that we I think, value, whether you're in business, whether you're in farming, whether you're in education, whether you're in law, or whether you're in medicine. Now, what do we all value in those areas? I mean, if you're going for a lawyer, you need a lawyer, or you're sick and you know you've got a serious illness, what do you want to find in a physician? Someone who has what? Expertise?
Integrity. It's not going to kill me.
And what? Experience, right? I mean, you don't want someone fresh out of medical school, do you? Who says, well, you know, I've read about this in the book, let me see. Right? You want people, you know, Paul and I are looking at, I'm looking at replanting an orchard. I'm not looking for some ag major at Fresno State who maybe is smart and done things, but he's never actually had to plant an orchard before. I'm going to people who have replanted orchards and know what amount of trees per acre I should be looking at, and what's the mix that I ought to be considering, and the trade-offs between my irrigation systems. So what I'm submitting to you is that experience and expertise, I believe that I've been able to obtain over the years, count for something. I think I know how to get things done. My opponent tried to make a whole case in the debate that we had Tuesday night, and that, you know, my time had gone. I mean, I was old. Kept referring to Mr. Costa, Mr. Costa. So, hold on a second. People call me Jim. I get called a lot of things. Jim's one of the nicer things. But so, you know, the whole ageist thing, you know. But I just think that when we're talking about people who are going to be, you know, I have the responsibility not only for 800,000 people here in the Valley in terms of being their problem solver, being their advocate, but also for, you know, the most important country in the world, America. And I have developed a lot of experience and expertise. I carefully weigh issues and monitor issues. I refer to other people who have more expertise and experience than I have when I'm looking on the Iran sanctions and whether or not we ought to pass this treaty to denuclearize, you know, this agreement with Iran, whether or not, you know, the new NAFTA 2 treaty, whether I'm going to vote to support it. And I want to talk to, you know, trade leaders throughout the country. I want to talk to our agriculture community. See, California is the #1 agricultural state in the nation. 44% of our agriculture is dependent upon trade. I want to find out how it deals with all the commodities here in California with this new agreement with Mexico and Canada before I ultimately make a decision. We'll have meetings. So experience and expertise, I think, are meaningful. And those who think that we ought to turn things around tells me one thing, and that is experience, yeah, who cares? And if you have some expertise, fine, and if you don't, who gives a damn? So that's why I think term limits are anti-American, at least in the concept of what we value. Anyway, thank you. You've been very, very attentive, and I hope, and do me a favor, all of you who raised your hand that says you're registered to vote, vote on Tuesday. It's your right as an American, and there's no good reason. The dog didn't eat your homework. You can't be too busy. There's absentee ballots, and it's important. And I don't care who you vote. Well, I do care a little bit. But vote. Exercise your right to vote.
Please get out there and vote.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, my dogs. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you very much. I was wondering whose skateboards those were. It's like a big one. Hello.
Head up them
Done. Yeah.
for the rest of the day.
Hey. How you doing? Where are you from?
My name is Clovis, but I'm from Visalia.
Visalia. Well, my father was born in Goshen.
Oh, okay.
And went to Packwood Elementary. I still have cousins. Frank and Leo, Tony Costa. A lot of ports there.
Maybe I'm gonna ask you a question.
There you go.
Is that your new meat?
What's that?
Is this your new meat? But Trump said that he wanted
This way tutor.
birthright.
I get a tutor, yes.
Yeah, but if he gets a